Um, First of all, I want to welcome everyone here who is on the panel, of course, and also those who will be attending in our audience, who will be welcome later on to join the conversation. First, I just want to let you know that last week I contracted a fairly serious bout of COVID, and that's why my voice is kind of and my brain's a little more foggier than usual, which, that may not be unusual, but so if I kind of look like I'm wandering or looking up in space, you'll know why. But hopefully that won't be a major issue. First, I want to thank you all for being part of the CBA First Time Innovative Book Discussion. I especially want to thank a couple of people, Joshua Scott, for assisting and organizing the event. Unfortunately, he has to teach this morning, so he couldn't join us. But stepping in for Joshua this morning, we're in very good, capable technical hands of Dr. Jillian Glass, who's assisted CBA in our past meetings, especially last year's annual general meeting at Santa Clara University. And I'm going to turn it over to Jillian now to explain some of the technical issues that come about in one of these things, which you're all very familiar with, but we need to go over it anyway. So, Jillian.
Thank you, Archie. So yes, hello, I am your Zoom support for today. This goes for the panelists, of course, and especially for our attendees. So throughout the discussion today, we encourage anyone and everyone who wants to be posting in the chat to do so. It is open to everybody. Once we get to the portion of today's event that is open discussion, anyone who is an attendee who would like to ask their question in person is invited to raise their hand. They will be moved from attendee to panelist. They can turn their camera on if they would like to at that point, ask their question, get their answer, and then they'll be moved back to attendee once their question has been answered and maybe there's been a little bit of back and forth. If you are new to Zoom and you don't know what I'm talking about when I say things like raise hand or chat, at the bottom of your Zoom window, there should be a series of pale gray icons on a black band, depending on whether you're on an iPad or an iPhone or another kind of tablet or phone. They may be a little hidden. There should be what looks like a speech bubble and the word chat. So you click on that to find the chat, and then you can write in the enter button, or sorry, in the blank space, hit enter, it'll be posted to everybody. Under the smiley face with reactions, if you were to click on that, you would see the button that says raise hand. That is how you would raise your hand when we get to the open portion for asking your question live. If at any point you need help, please do post in the chat, either to everyone or to me, and I will do my best to sort you out. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jillian. There's a couple more points and we'll get to it. Just as a reminder, which I don't need to remind anyone, we all need to be kind and constructive in our comments, particularly during the open discussion. So we'll briefly introduce our author and our panelists. This will be followed by Meghan giving a brief intro as to, I believe, why you wrote the book. I know that was very short notice, but do what you have anyway prepared. The book is, of course, Hell Hath No Fury, Gender, Disability, and the Invention of Damned Bodies in Early Christianity by Yale University Press. And I want to thank Yale Press and Abby Storch for providing the books to our panelists. Thank you. So each panelist will present about a 10-minute response to the question, what is gained or lost when we view Christian studies through a gender and disability lens? And then Meghan will follow up with her response to the panel's thoughts. We'll take a brief break, and then we'll come back for the open discussion at that point, or something along that line. So let me introduce our panelists first. First, I'll go with Meghan. Hopefully I get most of this right. Meghan Henning is the Associate Professor of Christian Origins at the University of Dayton. She holds a master's degree in Biblical Studies from Yale Divinity School and a doctorate in New Testament from Emory University. Meghan's first book with Morse Seebeck on the pedagogical function of hell and antiquity is entitled Educating Christians Through the Rhetoric of Hell. Seems like you're kind of stuck on hell a little bit, Meghan, but I'm stuck on Satan, so we're kind of in the same boat. Her second book, which we're discussing today, of course, she is the receiver of numerous grants and awards for her work. They're quite numerous, so I'm not going to name them all. Meghan has written for the Christian Century, provided commentary on the Daily Beast, and appeared in documentary on National Geographic Channel. So she's a TV star as well, and also on CNN. So welcome, Meghan. And the panelists, I'm going to kind of go in the order of how we're going to do the presentation. So Sarah, you will be first. So Sarah Emanuel is the Assistant Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in LA. She teaches courses in biblical studies and the early Jewish Jesus movement. In her research, Sarah examines the Bible as a collection of literary and cultural artifacts and draws on interdisciplinary theories such as trauma theory, humor theory, queer theory, and monster theory. Very interesting to engage its layered modes of meaning making. Her scholarship can be found in a variety of books and journals, including Biblical Interpretation, the Journal of Studies Old Testament, Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, and the forthcoming second edition of the Apocalypses in Context. She published her first book, Humor, Resistance, Jewish Culture Persistence, in the Book of Revelation, Roasting Rome, with Cambridge University in 2020. And her second monograph, Trauma Theory, Trauma Story, a Narration of Biblical Studies and the World of Trauma, with Brill in 2021. So welcome, Sarah. Emma Swy has recently completed her doctoral thesis, congratulations, entitled Too Far From Ideal, Disability and New Testament Writings at Liverpool Hope University in the UK, where she is also a part-time lecturer. Her research looks into the meta-narrative of disability and how the concept applies to New Testament portrayals of impairment. Emma has co-written a chapter entitled Excluded from the Kingdom or Leading the Revolution, Moroi and the Question of Intellectual Disability in New Testament Writing. So you can see the theme we've got going on here. To be published by Brepols, I hope that's how you pronounce that, in May, and is an edited volume, Madness in the Ancient World, Innate or Acquired, from Theoretical Concepts to Daily Life. Welcome, Emma. Eric Van Neckel is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Forrest S. Williams Teaching Chair in Humanities at Ferrum College in Virginia. He received his PhD in Judaism and Christianity from Antiquity from Marquette University in Milwaukee, and he also holds a master's degree from Marquette and Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Eric's primary area of interest is early Christian apocryphal literature, with a special focus on texts and traditions about the infancies and childhoods of Jesus and Mary, his mother. He is the author of But Their Faces Are All Looking Up, author and reader in the Provangelium of James, published by T.T. and Clark. And he's also the co-editor of Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts, published by Lexington Books. Sorry. So there, another connection. Welcome, Eric. And then Mara Kensky is currently the Joseph E. McCabe Professor of Religion and Director of Advising at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Kensky received her BA from Sarah Lawrence College and her MA and PhD in Biblical Studies in New Testament from University of Chicago. Her first book, Trying Man, Trying God, The Divine Courtroom, in Early Jewish and Christian Literature, published by Morse Seebeck in 2010. Her second book, Go to Hell, another hell connection here, Vicarious Travel with Peter and Paul in Earliest Christianity, is under contract with Birdman's, and a second book from Morse Seebeck, Isopsychos, the figure of Timothy in early Christian literature. So welcome, Clara. And then Grant McCaskill, which we're very happy you're here today, Grant, considering your current circumstances. Grant is the Kirby Lang Chair of New Testament Exegesis and co-director of the Center of Autism and Theology at the University of Aberdeen, as well as working on historical aspects of early Jewish and Christian traditions, particularly the Enoch literature. This is how Grant and I became acquainted. He works on the theological functioning of scripture in contemporary contexts. His most recent monographs include The New Testament and Intellectual Humility by Oxford in 2018 and Autism and the Church of Baylor University Press in 2019. So welcome, Grant. Thank you all for being here. So we'll begin our panel and discussion with Sarah. So please proceed.
Okay. Or was Megan going to introduce her book?
Sorry, my bad. You're right.
Okay.
See, brain fog. Thanks for the reminder. Megan, please.
I mean, by the end, you'll all be tired of hearing me talk, I'm sure. So this is hardly necessary, but thank you. I do want the opportunity to say thank you to Archie Wright, to Joshua Scott and Jillian Glass for organizing and putting on this panel. I'm really, really grateful and extremely grateful to each of the panelists for agreeing to do this, for taking time to spend even more time in hell than you might already be doing. To have people whose work you admire reading your book is the greatest gift. And so I'm really grateful for each of you being here today, as well as all the work that you put into making this happen at this point in your semester. So just briefly, I wanted to contextualize for just a few minutes. The book's been out for a bit, but just to give a sense of how it came to be. So this book, I had the idea for this book when I was thinking about ideas for my dissertation. So I've been thinking about it for some time. It was one of the possible ideas that I thought about writing about then, but I'm glad that I waited because I don't think that it would have been the book that it is if I had written it first. So for me, the order of things made sense here. This project emerged for me when I was starting to think about hell and was really inspired by Candida Moss's JBL article on the woman with the flow of blood, and thinking as I started to look at these texts, wow, there's a lot going on with the way that these bodies are represented in these texts in hell, that this is, yes, torture according to punitive mechanisms of the Roman Empire, but also the way in which bodies are described very vividly according to these rhetorical conventions is drawing upon cultural ideas about the body that touch on gender and disability, and also sometimes race and socioeconomic class. So I had never been able to kind of look away from that question. But with this project, I'm not just thinking about what people are doing rhetorically when they're talking about hell. I'm also thinking about how that rhetoric leverages ancient ideas about the body that we see in ancient medicine, in literature, in philosophy, as well as then bringing that to study an understudied group of text, the early Christian apocalypses, but also other texts in which there are tours of hell. So I did not limit this study to only the things that were typically considered within that genre. I wanted to look at all of the texts that built on the texts in that genre. So I included a lot of the Marian texts that might have journeys to hell, for example, included in a Dormition narrative, or other places that you might not expect it. In chapter 4, I talk about the dissensus literature. Again, a big scholarly no-no when it comes to genre. You're not supposed to talk about the dissensus with the apocalypses, but yeah, I was already talking about gender and disability with apocalypses, so why not, I thought. And really, to be serious though, I thought that there's something to be added by crossing those generic lines and thinking about the way in which early Christians may have been thinking about these things together rather than consistently separating them. And we do have evidence as we go further and further into history that that Christians are starting to think about these things across generic lines. So here I'm bringing my earlier interest in the pedagogical function of hell in antiquity to starting to think about hell as a beginning and not as an end, about why it is and how it is that people make hell on earth, and what ancient authors are doing when they make hell. As performances of visual rhetoric, I think that the depictions of hell that we see in these ancient texts and late ancient texts are drawing upon imagery that's familiar to the audience to stimulate their imagination, but in doing so, the effeminate and disabled body becomes emblematic of sin. And so I'm trying to think about apocalypses not just as imaginary or banal popular literature, as much of 20th century scholarship on these texts did, but thinking about them at the nexus between the imaginary and the real. And there I'm joining a large community of scholars that have been doing that in the last 20 years in the scholarship on apocalypses, including lots of people in this Zoom room. So I think that's all that I want to say to situate the work. I'm sure that you all will have stimulating questions and topics to take this in another direction that beyond just sort of where my thoughts were when I started. But thank you again for all of the questions that you're going to bring.
Thank you, Megan. So we'll turn now to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. So I want to start by thanking Archie Wright, Joshua Scott, Jillian Glass, Yale University Press, and the Catholic Biblical Association for planning, assisting, and inviting me to take part in this conversation. Thanks also to you, Dr. Henning, for writing this phenomenal book and inviting us to take part in the world of ideas alongside you. Dr. Henning's Hell Hath No Fury, Gender, Disability, and the Invention of Damned Bodies in Early Christian Literature argues that the othering of female, effeminate, and disabled bodies in ancient Christian rhetorical imaginations of hell were not created ex nihilo. They often reflected and reified contemporaneous social norms, which in turn contributed to the sustained and further othering of female, effeminate, and disabled bodies in lived reality. Quote, the body that threatens in hell becomes the threatening body on earth, end quote. Henning also shows us the extent to which identity is always already intersectional, which to the question of today's discussion, I think is a gain of a gender studies and disability studies lens. Disabled bodies in antiquity were effeminate bodies, and effeminate bodies were, at best, lesser abled bodies. In Henning's words, quote, the understanding of the sick body overlapped with the understanding of the female body, which was also marked by flux, pain, and an unruliness that required constant discipline and regulation. The unregulated, undisciplined bodies, sickly and womanly bodies, provided the building blocks for the torments of early Christian hell, end quote. This is not to say that categories and meanings of bodies are fixed, however. Christ, after all, the supreme hero of these early Christian writers, was demailed and de-abled in his crucifixion. And interestingly, as Henning points out, crucifixion was not a punishment in early visions of hell. In short, just as women's bodies were in flux, so too were and are ideologies. Something I appreciate from Henning's evocation of disability studies is her refusal to manipulate or apologize for texts so as to make them good or whole. Disability study seems, in a way, at least on my reading, to counter certain liberationist trends that, at least in biblical studies, liberates by making a text different from what it is, by changing it, colonizing it, so as to create what the interpreter wants. In Revelation 2, for example, Jesus, as a resurrected Christ, throws Jezebel, John's rival prophet, onto a bed, Kline, so as to be punished for her sexual wrongdoings. Despite this punishment being about sex, and despite sex, including forced sex, occurring on beds, many readers claim that beds were also spaces for people to rest when ill, and so Jezebel must be made ill by Christ instead of raped by Christ, which is an easier and friendlier interpretation. Indeed, we are so obsessed with things being good or right or wholesome when reading biblical and early Christ-centered literature that we, one moment, Sorry, my mouse is not scrolling down, that we don't realize that we are the ones bending, twisting, and puncturing our sources. We create holes so as to make things ostensibly whole, but not Henning. Instead, Henning relies on disability studies' oft refusal to fix perspective, and even brings it to her work with gender. Just as disability and gender intersect in the economy of the body, so too do the theories of disability and gender in Hell Hath No Fury. In a deeply refreshing exposition on the role of female martyrs in early Christianity, for example, Henning rejects the notion that Christian martyrologists wrote about women because they were destabilizing contemporaneous patriarchal ideals. Instead, Henning asserts they wrote about women because of these ideals. Quote, "The female martyrs were popular because they already possessed bodies that needed to suffer in order to effect change for others and reveal hidden truths." In short, the ancient Christian woman makes an excellent martyr because she conforms to the cultural expectation of the female body as a suffering body, end quote. My pushback, interestingly, is not about disability studies or gender studies, but instead about my own work with trauma theory. Henning's monograph has persuaded me to reconsider a starting point I frequently take in my own studies, which is that Jews and Christ confessors in antiquity often crafted their stories as an attempt to speak the unspeakable, that is, to name and process and even perform through writing what we today might call trauma. Trauma, by definition, refers to an event or events that shatter one's sense of being, integrity, and safety in the world to the point that it creates psychic splits within the self. It is also subjective. A shared event may shatter one sense of being and not another's. As Henning observes, however, most people in antiquity suffered, and they suffered greatly. Rhetorical hell reflected lived hell, that is, hell on earth. In other words, given the extent to which persons in antiquity experienced life as that which is always already shattering, I wonder now if ancient pain, as enormous as it may seem to readers of 2023, was in fact standard, normative, nothing new, nothing shattering, and therefore not what we would define as trauma. More to Henning's work on disability, however, I do remain curious about the capaciousness of the term. Given, like trauma, the extent to which conceptions of ability and disability are both contextual and subjective, how do we discuss disability without falling into deconstruction? Is there a difference, for instance, between ancient conceptions of vice, such as loss of self-control, gluttony, gender-bending sex, etc., and disability? If so, why? If not, why use the term? And when does righteous suffering or righteous gender bending or disablement, such as we see in the Christ figure, end, and not righteous gender bending or disablement begin? How do we know? Does disability or body-mind variations intersect so deeply with other spaces that we lose the integrity or usefulness of the term and theory? Finally, I will end by saying that as much as Henning asserts at the beginning of her monograph that the body politics of antiquity are different from today, and that we must begin our studies of antiquity with that difference in mind, I appreciate her later considerations of modern parallels. Yes, there are differences, but reading Henning's book has made me realize how wary I have become of such clear, ancient modern bifurcations of body politics in post-2016 United States. I worry, perhaps alongside Henning, and perhaps counter to my comments on trauma above, indeed nothing is fixed, that we have assumed modernity is the good place, when in fact, given so many familiar, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, and ableist Christian hellscapes, it seems hauntingly and painfully bad. These are a few of the questions and comments I have in response to Henning's remarkable work. I remain grateful to her for writing it, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very good. Emma, you're up next.
Thank you. The first thing I wanted to say is thank you so much for having me as part of this discussion, but also having the discussion itself, because I think the issues that we're discussing are really, really important ones. And my own research centers around the presentation of disability in the New Testament, but I do think the questions that Meghan Henning looks at in Hell Hath No Fury are pertinent to what I do and study of the New Testament itself. So I've gathered just a few thoughts about how gender and disability studies can shape our understanding, but coming from that point of view, the point of view of New Testament studies. In the interests of total honesty, when I was first asked the question of what's gained or lost by looking at text from a gender or disability perspective, my first response was we lose an automatically patriarchal and ableist interpretation. Now, that might be interpreted by some as a touch flippant and betraying more of my politics than perhaps it should. But after some careful consideration, and in light of some of the questions raised by Henning's book, I do actually believe that there's validity in that response. For me, one of the most important things that Hell Hath No Fury does is pose questions that we can then take when approaching other ancient literature. On the first page of the book, Henning states that Hell Hath No Fury examines the ancient cultural assumptions about the body that Christians invented, amended, and employed as they developed a notion of punitive suffering in hell. But it's the implications of that analysis that I personally find the most interesting. Henning foregrounds the acknowledgement that ancient texts are constructed according to cultural assumptions, in that the body is not a universal concept. And as readers, we're forced to confront the idea that we have our own preconceptions of corporeality, that our interpretations are affected by our corporeal assumptions, that we might just be as ableist as the ancient texts we're horrified by. Effectively, to borrow a phrase from the late David Kleins, one of the things that Hell Hath No Fury does is to participate in consciousness raising regarding the previously dismissed areas of gender and disability. Now, disability may not have existed as a named concept in disability, but I agree with Roy McClary and Wayne Morris that we all subscribe to a model of disability unconsciously or otherwise. Now, they might have been writing from a more modern perspective, but we do see obvious examples of bodies marked as deviant in the text examined by Henning. And those bodies are culturally constructed in ancient texts as crossing some kind of corporeal boundary. The question that the idea of deviance leads me to is, where exactly is that boundary? It's a boundary of acceptability, but where is it and who constructs it? Corporeal standards in ancient literature may have been different to the ones we adhere to now, but whilst we cannot reliably diagnose impairments, what can be identified are the descriptions of those perceived to deviate from a social or cultural perceptions of effective functioning. If, as Caroline Husband suggests, the body is a truly social construct contingent on communities, then what Henning evidences is how some of those contextual communities created their own standards of functionality according to the corporeal traits valued at that point in time. What we see through the tours of hell is the creation of corporeal boundaries reflecting and influencing who was and who was not allowed to participate in the believing community. That dynamic, a consideration of social organization, is an important question to take to any ancient text, but especially canonical ones. We have to remember, as Henning asserts, that our sources were written by persons with a relatively high degree of social power, normative persons within the social and cultural boundaries of corporeal acceptability. Male and normative authors exclude or at least obscure the female and non-normative experience. We see this in New Testament writings, but it appears amplified in the tours of hell, and I cannot help but wonder if this amplification fed into the reception of New Testament writings, but then I'm not a receptionist historian. In paying attention, though, to how ancient cultures categorized and understood bodies, we're effectively paying attention to the culturally constructed body in the literature, which often conveys an ideal body as a standard of belief. And I would agree with Henning that we need to apply a cultural model of disability and consider that construction, or we risk minimizing ancient texts. For example, when we think about the paralyzed man carried on a stretcher in Luke 5, we often picture a weakened figure carried by Olympic standard strongmen because they're the ones doing good, as it were. Yet we know that if we look at the work of academics like Caroline Vout and Christy Upson-Sire, that bodies were a lot more diverse than the stereotype, and that ancient people understood sickness and suffering to be the normal default state of being. And if you read Hell Hath No Fury in conjunction with the work of such academics, as well as Anna Rebecca Solveig, you start to really appreciate that discussion on how the boundary of deviance is created, how it is demarcated in terms of distance from an ideal, rather than whether that ideal was met or not. If we return to considering Luke 5, do we see the text differently if those carrying the stretcher are not Olympic heroes and are instead impaired bodies, even if they're not deemed deviant or non-normative? Texts then, as Henning shows, become part of the mechanism of setting up boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable, not just mirroring, but constructing lived reality by setting up these social boundaries. And this raises the question about the people writing those ancient texts. If they did not meet a corporeal ideal, were they trying to construct boundaries in order to protect their own social position? Texts which contain any kind of corporeal judgment become, by demarcating classification, a means of social influence, organization, and control. How does that awareness of an author's position affect how we interpret texts? I know that primarily tours of hell are about damnation and the association of disability, or at least certain impairments, with sin as a means of establishing a social hierarchy. But for me, the sections of Hell Hath No Fury, which I found fascinating, are those which raise the possibility of a challenge to that automatic association of sin and disability, positing that alternative interpretations and perspectives are possible, even in texts founded on physiognomic consciousness. It's important that Henning notes the incongruency and inconsistency of standards between texts, that there are hell-bound bodies that challenge concepts of bodily normativity, and that Hell Hath No Fury highlights, for example, the Marian tours of hell bringing the challenge of the female body as a satorical agent. If we acknowledge that challenge can occur in texts where boundaries and meta-narratives associated with deviance seem fairly definite, then we can acknowledge moments of resistance elsewhere. A lot of our interpretations of ancient texts are based on our own cultural assumptions, and disability is rarely depicted as a positive in ancient literature, though that's not to say there are never any positive aspects or elements to portrayals of disabled characters. When we take our supposedly traditional interpretations to New Testament healing narratives, we have a Christological focus on how Jesus transforms a wrong body into a right body, ignoring any potential agency on the part of the disabled person. Yet to my mind, if we take away some of the amplified negativity, we might see in the story of the man with the withered hand in Mark 5, for example, that there's no evidence of healing until the man chooses to extend his hand and provide a demonstration. The man has agency, a choice as to whether he participates. He's involved in events and has, albeit limited, power. We read negative values into narrative gaps and/or ignore possible elements of challenge which do not fit the judgment of deviance, made according to the boundaries a text puts in place. It's important that we use a gender and/or disability lens to pay attention to those moments of challenge, or we risk simply propagating an automatically ableist or misogynistic viewpoint. In analysing just how demonstrably negative portrayals of disability and gender can be, Henning places this possibility right at the centre of our metaphorical field of vision. Now, I've only outlined a collection of thoughts prompted by Henning's book, but perhaps the most important question raised is in the relation to the interaction between gender and disability. It's a rarely considered question in relation to ancient texts. How far is the issue gender? How far is the issue disability? We need to consider the potential hierarchy created in text in relation to these categories. In New Testament writings, there's a rarity in combined reference, but there is a relationship. Candida Moss, for example, in the article already mentioned by Sarah, talks about that interrelation of the woman with the flow of blood and Jesus both having porous bodies. Currently, I'm working on the interrelation between the bent over woman in Luke 13 and Zacchaeus in Luke 19. Both could be considered disabled and both are referred to as children of Abraham, yet each of these two people is depicted differently, with Zacchaeus allowed to socially interact with Jesus and on a basic level have a name, whereas the woman has no name, is known by her disability and disappears once it's removed. That said, the woman is healed and Zacchaeus is not, but the relationship between disability and gender in ancient text is both complex and obviously present. So why don't we pay attention to it, since, as Henning shows, it's fruitful ground for analysis? We need to quote Henning, look at bodies as subjects that transcend dichotomies like normal to abnormal and think about identity in ways that are multidirectional and also intersectional. When we do that, we gain a wider and perhaps truer understanding of ancient texts. We can never totally remove our own preconceptions or even understand ancient texts on their own terms, but by raising our consciousness of alternative perspectives, we can begin to engage in a more honest way with ancient literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for your comments. Appreciate it.
Sorry, you muted. Is that me? Am I up? Is that me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Great. So echoing Sarah and Emma, I want to just say thanks to CBA and Archie for the invitation for this event, and to Jillian for working behind the scenes, and Josh. It's really exciting, I think, to sort of think about what sorts of different forms book reviews might take. And as somebody who's currently far behind on a more traditional book review, I really love the just like, let's get together and talk about it on Zoom. So let's do more of these. I want to start today by saying that I really, really love this book. It is meticulously researched, it is sharp, it is insightful, and to be fair, none of those things were surprising to me given its author. I read this book as a scholar of early Christianity, whose research does not focus on early Christian hellscapes, and also as somebody who knows, if I can admit this, relatively little about the particularities of disability studies and the opportunities and challenges that it poses to our field. But these are things that I want to know more about, and this book was both a crash course and a deep dive. So I learned a lot. I've got more and better questions now than I had when I started. I will also say that this book is a page turner and difficult to put down. Now that was a surprise because, of course, considering that the book catalogs and explores the various ways that Christian authors over the past 2,000 years have imagined damned bodies in hell being roasted, eaten, and otherwise tormented for all eternity. One might assume that a book like this is one that you wouldn't quite want to read, although here we are. So if you don't have a copy, get one. Make sure your library gets one. And thank you, Meghan, for your wonderful, fantastic, engaging piece of scholarship, wonderful achievement and contribution. So thank you. Now to business. The question that we were asked to reflect on for the purposes of this conversation is, quote, what is gained or lost when we view Christian studies through a gender and disability lens? So when I was first kind of starting to think about this and read the book through with this question in mind, I turned that or very inadvertently into an and so I was fully prepared to talk about the lost as well, but also I then wrote too much, and so we're really going to focus on the gained. And I think that probably I'm inclined to think that we gain far more than we lose anyway with a lens like this, but that's going to be my focus today. So what is gained? Quite frankly, a lot. I think I want to offer my rationale for that answer through two different contexts. The first is the classroom. So let's take a little bit of a different tack here and talk about the classroom. And in my case, what this means is the undergraduate classroom in my western corner of rural Virginia. Like many of us who are trained in the critical study of Christian origins in particular and religious studies more broadly, one of my goals in my classroom is to show students that theology is often, if not always, autobiography. The way that people speak about the gods and the types of claims that they make about what the gods are like speaks volumes about how they see themselves and the communities of which they are part. And of course, this is not a one-way street. How people conceive of the gods reflects how they see themselves, but people also see themselves in that certain way because they come to believe that this is what the gods want. We create the gods in our own image. We also create ourselves in the image of the gods. Henning argues that something similar is happening with the way that early Christians imagined hellscapes and the damned bodies that inhabit them. In terms of what is gained when we view Christian studies through this sort of lens, I think one of the primary things is a critical framework to think about corporeality and also what constitutes an ideal body, or maybe we could just say a normal body. As Henning shows on nearly every page of this book, the ideal body in early Christianity is, for the most part, the male body, and early Christians are here drawing from their broader ideological contexts. The bodies of the damned are imagined as effeminate, leaky, and pierced and or penetrated. I'm very glad I have the ability to show you my scare quotes here. Damned bodies are also depicted as deviant in some way from a normal body, incomplete or dismembered, blind, etc. But this also is not a one-way street. Early Christian authors imagined damned bodies in light of what they consider to be inferior or deviant, but the images that they construct also become instructive for those who are reading and consuming them. As Meghan states so aptly and concisely in her conclusion, quote, the damned body was not simply a mirror for ancient ideas about the body or retributive logic. Rather, the body in early Christian visions of hell both reflects and constructs lived reality. So in terms of the classroom then, I think that one of the things to be gained from an approach like this is that it gives us some tools to help students think not only about how early Christians think about corporeality, what is normal, deviant, disabled, etc., but also how they themselves think about these things and why, whether theologically or not. Thomas Aquinas believed that when humans were resurrected bodily, that they would all be resurrected as either 32 or 33 years old. His logic was that Jesus was crucified and allegedly resurrected when he was 33, but he also just simply says everyone knows that 33 is the perfect age. So obviously the gold standard for the age of the glorified body. But of course, the Gospels do not state Jesus's age, so something else is going on here. What is it about 33? Tradition? Sure. Also, there are ideas at work here about what constitutes an ideal human body. I would venture a guess that my students are pondering such questions in light of more athletic or aesthetic categories, but the same types of dynamics are here at work. The other context that I want to explore is the Society of Biblical Literature. And before I dive into this, I want to assure all of you that there are no dystopian hellscape punchlines coming, certainly no discussion of damned colleagues. Rather, I want to talk about something that happened last year that really fascinated me and that I've continued to think about. And now that I've read this book, it fascinates me even more. So I co-chair the Ancient Fiction and Early Christian Jewish Narrative Program Unit. And in spring of 2022, we put together a call for papers for 3 sessions to take place at the annual meeting this last year in Denver. One of those sessions was described as follows, quote, "The focus of the second session will be on disability in ancient fiction. For this session, we invite proposals that address the representation, description, and or construction of disabled bodies or neurodivergence in ancient fiction." The idea for this session came from our steering committee, and we included it in the call for papers without any sense of what was going to come back to us. And if any of y'all have served on steering committees before, you know that's often what happens. You put out a call and everyone just sort of sends you a bunch of stuff. We figured that we would get a range of topics. After all, disability is a pretty broad subject matter, so we figured we'd get a range. But frankly, we were wrong. We didn't get that many abstracts, but every abstract that we received for this session focused on one single disability, blindness. So when life hands you a collection of abstracts on blindness, you create a panel on blindness. So the old saying goes. And that's what we did. Papers in this session were then followed by an invited response from Daniel C. Smith, who is currently a visiting assistant professor of classics and religion at Whitman College in Washington State. Daniel works on apocalypses, exoticism, and disability in the Roman Empire, and is himself a blind scholar. I unfortunately wasn't able to be at this session, but I heard great things about the conversation that ensued. Back to the question at hand, though. Why did a call for papers on disabled bodies and or neurodivergence in ancient fiction produce a crop of abstracts that focused exclusively on blindness? It's not even a little bit tempting to dismiss this as a coincidence, but I've continued to kind of puzzle over it. Why blindness? Having read this book, I don't necessarily have an answer. Meghan, maybe you do. But I do have some interesting ideas. Meghan's discussion of blindness in this book is relatively brief, but also very dense. And the part that I'm most interested in spans pages 87 to 90. Here she discusses blindness in early Christian conceptions of hell as a punishment that mirrors the bodily suffering of other real bodies. That's page 87. Which is to say that readers who are touring hell through literature encounter in blind bodies an image that is familiar to them from the real world. Henning points out that blindness in cognate ancient literature is often employed as a metaphor for ignorance. Certainly this usage is both present and common in early Christian texts as well. Paul's Damascus Road experience in Acts 9 comes to mind as a story that is playing with this. The beauty of this book, though, is that Henning is not simply interested in how early Christians imagined hell. Rather, the trajectory, as has been mentioned, is focused on how those conceptions of torment and punishment also affect how early Christians come to understand their own bodies and the bodies of others. The title of this book's conclusion is quite instructive here, quote, "Making Hell on Earth." I'll share one relevant quote before returning to the SBL. As the conceptions of blindness as metaphor and punishment are fused in the context of early Christian apocalypse, the idea that physical blindness is the consequence of sin is intensified and codified. That's page 90. Now, what does any of this have to do with our call for papers? It is not the case, first of all, that those who proposed abstracts in ancient fiction last year believed that blindness is a punishment for and consequence of sin. At least I would hope not, and that's certainly not what I'm trying to suggest here. Instead, I'm thinking about this through that rubric of making hell on earth and how we as scholars conceive of the tools that we need to do our work. What does that work entail? Well, thinking, of course, but also examining texts, other artifacts, as well as writing about them, editing that writing, etc. And we use our eyes for these things, at least most of us do. Now, one of the things that Daniel Smith pursues in his own research are methods that blind readers, both ancient and modern, could use to explore manuscripts. It's really fascinating stuff. It's available online. I'd suggest you check it out. But for the majority of scholars, these tools are unnecessary because, ocularly speaking, the majority of us are normal, ocularly speaking. And while this does not mean that we conceive of blindness as punishment, perhaps it does suggest that blindness stands out in our field, perhaps even subconsciously, as a disability that would make life as a scholar uniquely difficult, perhaps even, dare we say, hellish. Finishing up, because I think I've probably already gone a little bit too long, this is a phenomenal book. It has enhanced my understanding of early Christian texts and imaginations. It's also done plenty for helping me think about my own world as well. So thank you, Meghan. I look forward to the conversation after this.
Thank you, Eric, for your comments. We now turn to Mara. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Catholic Biblical Association. I am now immediately terrified because everyone who's come before me had such really insightful things to say. So first of all, I'm delighted to get a chance to thank Meghan in person-ish for writing this book. I was a huge fan of Meghan's first book, Educating Christians Through the Rhetoric of Hell, which has been very fruitful for me in my research, not only because it taught me some stuff about hell, but also because it's very rich in bibliography and pointed me to a lot of great other things to read. So it really led me on a whole journey of reading. And that is one of the things I would like to talk about when it comes to this book, right? So in thinking about the question, what is gained or lost, right, by applying a lens of gender and disability, I really was very selfish in my thinking about it and really thought to myself, what is gained or lost for me, right, in my own research when applying these lenses? And unlike maybe some of you on this panel, I'm currently writing a book on hell. And my book focuses on the idea of hell as these tours as travel literature, right? What does it mean to travel through hell with Peter and Paul and Mary and other, Hades explorers that we have textually? And so I ordered the book immediately, right? And I was very excited when it came, and I set aside time to read it. And as soon as I started opening it, which, by the way, for those of you who haven't read the book in the attendance, the book is not organized in terms of like this tour of hell and that tour of hell and this vision of hell and that vision of hell. It's organized thematically, right? So with a clear thesis and then different ways of approaching at that thesis, gendered ideas about suffering, what does it mean to become female in hell, right? And thinking about hell as the damned, as Meghan says, inhabiting these disabled female bodies, imprisoned bodies for all eternity, with a chapter specifically focused on Marian literature. So it's not organized by tour, which a lot of books about hell are. Right, it's not organized by tour. And my book will totally be organized by tour also, right? Maybe that's a lazy way of doing it. I have taken the easy way out here for me on this one. One of the things that I immediately realized was that this book was full of information that I did not know. Right? I just didn't know it. I learned a lot from reading this book. I learned a lot about ideas about worms, for example, and like,
about leaky bodies. I learned a lot about different theories of crying and fire. I learned a lot about the debates in antiquity that are more pronounced that our literature makes them out to be, about what is a body, what is a male body, what is a female body. So I learned a great deal. I developed, just like for Meghan's first book, a whole list of other sources that I wanted to look at, right, and that I wanted to think about. I was grossed out by some of the things that I learned about in this book, which is always a sign of a good book. So in thinking about, well, what makes a book good, right? One of the things is that it teaches you something you didn't know. And so for me, this was really a very useful book, right, in that way. The other thing I think that makes a book good is that it makes you see things differently. And there were definitely times in this, when reading this book, where I kind of sat up and thought, oh no, this is a whole new problem for me to think about that I hadn't really considered when I was working on, a certain passage. So I wanted to give you an example of that. I thought I might give you an example of how this book brings up questions and issues that can problematize conclusions that you'd already made, right, about what's going on in these texts. So if that's okay, that's what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. And my example is from the Apocalypse of Paul, right, which is a super popular text, right? It was a popular text in antiquity. It was very influential. It was extremely popular in the Middle Ages, right? Like its influence was high. And the example that I'm going to talk about is actually from Paul's tour of paradise rather than Paul's tour of hell, which makes up a later part of the book. So in the middle of Paul's trip to paradise, there's a very affecting scene, right? Where Paul is going to cross the Acherusian Lake, which is with waters much whiter than milk. This is from Visio Paul 22. He crosses it in like a cool boat. And then when he crosses it, right, he is accompanied to the shores of the city of Christ by the sound of approximately 3,000 angels. And he enters the city, which is made of gold, and it's circled by 12 walls and 12 interior towers, with a full stade between each encircling walls. And he sees 12 gates, and he sees 4 rivers. And as Paul does in his text, he asks a lot of questions about what he sees for our own edification, right? So Paul and the readers who are watching this, with Paul, view a scene which is so affecting for him that he weeps over it. So this is in Visio Paul 24, it says this: "When I entered the gate, I saw trees great and very high before the doors of the city, having no fruit but leaves only. And I saw a few men scattered in the midst of the trees, and they lamented greatly when they saw anyone enter the city. And the trees were sorry for them and humbled themselves and bowed down and again erected themselves." So Paul sees these men crying and lamenting when someone gets to enter the city, and the trees were weeping over them in sorrow, and this leads him to weep as well. And so this is a very sad scene, because it's clear that the men who are among the trees are not able to go in the city, and the trees are so affected by this that they literally bow their boughs before returning upright. And this is the imagery of the bent trees is very arresting. It's the most pathos shown by any inhabitants of the spaces of the Visio Pauli at all. Right, so it's a very effective scene. And he asked the angel, that is, Paul asked the angel, who are these men who are not allowed to enter the city? And he gets this lengthy answer. And so he's told, these are they who zealously abstain day and night in fasts, but they had a proud heart above other men, glorifying and praising themselves and doing nothing for their neighbors. They gave some people friendly greeting, but to others they didn't even say hi. And indeed, they showed hospitality only to those whom they wished. And if they did anything whatever for their neighbor, they were immoderately puffed up. So in other words, the angel tells Paul that these men worship God, but forego ethical treatment of their neighbor and picked and choose whom they wanted to treat well. So Paul identifies the root cause of this issue as pride, and the angel confirms it. But then Paul presses on to ask about the trees and why they bow themselves over and over again. And the angel responds, the whole time which these men passed on earth, they zealously served God. But on account of the shame and reproaches of men, for a time they blushed and humbled themselves, but they were not saddened, nor did they repent that they should desist from the pride which was in them. This is why the trees humble themselves and again are raised up. So frankly, this is an odd answer. Right? The angel seems to tell Paul here that the trees are humbling themselves because the men on earth did not, and they're somehow representing for the men what the men should have done while they were on earth. But this explanation doesn't really account for what the narrator tells us, which is that the trees feel sorry for the men in this position. On the one hand, this may not be intended as a punishment at all, but rather trees doing their work of men in order to make up for their lack of humility on earth. Right? In this way, it's type of efficacious performance with the trees kind of working on men's behalf every time the door opens to the city, right? And the angel's explanation is a little bit unsatisfactory and even contradicted by the scene that Paul witnesses, because the reader has been expressly told that the trees feel sorry for the men. And so it's a gesture of sorrow to fall to ground to be sure, but the more straightforward reading of bowing and returning upright is not lament, but rather prayer. That in these scenes, the trees seem to be praying on behalf of the men. But the question and how this is related really to some of the insights that Meghan presents in her book is the question of, well, why are the trees feeling so sorry for the men? And what does it mean to see men standing at the door of the city and unable to enter and crying over about it, so much that Paul cries over about it? So in my research, I kind of posit this idea that these men are kind of stand-ins for the readers, right, who are reading the text and sort of seeing themselves. But so I kind of had moved on from this in my mind by the time I got to Meghan's book. But then I read what she had to say about weeping, right? And that's when I sort of sat up and said, okay, I got to think about this again, right? Because Meghan says that weeping, in some ways, represent compromised male bodies engaged in a feminine response to an overwhelming emotion, right? So what I'm taking as pathos, like the picture of these men and the trees lamenting and weeping over the situation, I'm now stepping back and saying, but wait, if the reader is supposed to think about or has an idea that weeping is female and like not good, maybe I'm actually should be asking, are we really supposed to feel sorry for these men, or are we supposed to engage with them in a different way? So that's the way, and there were many other instances that I could have brought up, right, from the book to show you like how something that Meghan said made me rethink my own assumptions and conclusions as I'm writing. And that's the one that really stuck out to me, that I might have gotten weeping just totally wrong this whole time. And I really need to, and I have been doing that, go back and think about it for sure. So one of the things that I think is really gained is a way for us to see something that maybe we take for granted in a just totally new way, in a totally different way than what we've seen it. Another example, and I'll stop here in a second, of something that made me sit up differently is because I'm so focused on geographical markers in my kind of way of traveling through these texts, right? That I hadn't really focused on the bodies necessarily as the geography. And that is something that Meghan says very clearly in the book. The primary landmarks are the bodies, right, in hell. And so what I want to do is think about how bodies are geographic markers and how they add to the travel experience. Right? So I think that this book is really worth reading, even if you don't work on hell, right? Even if you don't work on bodies, right? Because it will make you take a step back and think, no, I got to think about that again. And I got to think about what I'm doing again from a different perspective. Okay, I think I've gone over time, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much for writing this book. This was great.
Thank you, Mayor. Really appreciate that. So now we turn to Grant. Thank you. Welcome.
Sure. Thanks, Archie. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be involved in this discussion today, particularly because Meghan's wonderful book intersects with my own recent and ongoing research on the pseudepigrapha, especially Second Enoch, which has an awful lot of material on hell and on places of torture in it, and also on disability studies, particularly in relation to autism. And these points of connection between our projects, I think, will come through in my comments. Now, as everyone's noted, we were asked to speak specifically on what's gained or lost when we view the texts of late antiquity through the lens of gender and/or disability studies. Now, I might, by way of segue into my own comments, note something even in that specific posing of the question that's been highlighted elsewhere by Louise Lawrence. And I say this, by the way, not as any critical comment on the organisers, but just by way of reflection on how deeply and how persistently we need to think about these issues. Because this form of words itself draws on an account of interpretation that presumes a particular functioning of the faculty of sight and a particular refractive role for the lens. View and lens map the act of interpretation onto sight, with a tacit ableism underlying this. Even if the interpreter requires a lens, they must have some capacity for sight if they're to interpret. How do we describe those who can't read well? We describe them as blind, invoking a disability. And at the same time, the lens is potentially an external device that colors or bends the perception of the object. Now, on one level, this reflects the phenomena of embodiment that pervade our language, something considered particularly by conceptual metaphor theory. But it also provides a window onto the extent to which the culture of interpretation operates with a kind of normalcy, mapped onto an understanding of the investigator's mind and body and their relationship to the object of study. When the mind and body operate properly and with the proper methodology, particularly in modernity, they can obtain the neutral truth of the object, they can attain objectivity. Approaches to interpretation that are particularized, such as gender or disability studies, are considered marginal. Curious departures from this objectivity that have value, provided they aren't confused with the main thing itself. Now, gender and disability studies seek to challenge the neutrality of these approaches, highlighting the extent to which they are themselves unwittingly normalized by a particular construction of normal, such that they are actually in their own ways disabled, incapable of attaining a genuine grasp of the object as something other, and always projecting their own normality onto its interpretation. The white interpretation is actually no more neutral than the black. The cis interpretation is no more neutral than the trans, the able no more neutral than the disabled, the male no more neutral than the non-male. And recognizing this, I think, allows us to identify the particular burdens that each brings to the act of interpretation and how these limit the act of interpretation if unwittingly allowed to totalize it. It invites us to reflect on how we pursue a-centered interpretations, to use the language of Deleuze and Guattari. Now, Meghan's book accomplishes this in a range of interesting ways, and my own comments will reflect some of these that reflect particularly with me as a disabled interpreter. So I'm autistic, and I'm comfortable for that to be considered a disability, which is not true of all autistic people. And I'm also an interpreter who's worked particularly on traditions outside of the canon of the Western Church. So the first point that I want to note is particularly concerned with the choice of writings, which is primarily the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. Those writings are themselves usually treated as marginal, partly because the concept of canon is often, I think, functionally confused with the modern form of the printed Bible, as distinct from being a list of works ascribed a particular species of authority. Meghan's study highlights the vital place of these works in the tradition as they connect to the developing cultural imagination about hell. That resonates with my own work on Second Enoch, which has either been categorized as the work of a fringe sect because of its hard to place views that don't align with the descriptors authorized or offered by the authoritative voices of the traditions, or it's had its more difficult elements excised or explained away. My own view is that what it actually represents are widespread phenomena of cultural recombination. It's not marginal, but it reflects what happens when particular religious traditions encounter other religious and philosophical traditions and lived experience in a complex culture. Now, the exclusion of difficult works like Second Enoch or like the Pseudepigrapha or the Apocrypha often allows readers to project a certain kind of normalcy back onto ancient or medieval Christianity, the liberative instinct that's been highlighted before. It allows us to treat the authorized tradition of canon and treatise as something that aligns with contemporary readings, that they are liberative, while apocryphal works can be marginalized and often seen as representing the weird views of the uneducated. But these accounts of hell are actually the work of educated, erudite sophisticates, almost by definition, since they're written works, and this has been highlighted already. The fact that such views of the female and the disabled could be held by the intelligent elite is important for us to consider, and their relevance to the task of contextualizing the authoritative tradition is enormous. This is mainstream stuff. Now, the second point that struck me forcefully was Meghan's concern to challenge the distinction between the real and the imagined. This emerged particularly in the opening chapter and then again in her discussion of Foucault's account of space, a discussion that I think could be developed still further in interesting ways in relation to the work of Soja and Lefebvre on critical spatiality, and that I think can speak back to many of the biblical appropriations of critical spatiality. The reason this struck me, this intention to close the gap between the real and the imagined, is that it seems analogous in many ways to the discussion of person or identity first language in disability studies, though it'll take me a little bit to try and explain the connection that I see here, so please bear with me. There's a well-intentioned practice of using person-first language when speaking about disabilities, including, in my experience, autism, whether or not you consider it a disability. So the practice is that we speak of persons with autism. Now, this originated as a way of resisting the depersonalizing of people affected by those conditions by asserting their personhood up front. The problem is that research shows that a lot, maybe even most disabled and autistic people don't like it because it fails to grasp the centrality of their condition to their identity. So I wouldn't be me if I weren't autistic, I would be someone else. It's not detachable from that identity as the word with implies. It also presumes that the condition necessarily jeopardizes their status of personhood such that it needs to be moved to the end of the clause, so that it is intrinsically negative. The construction is considered, in fact, essentially dehumanizing by many disabled and autistic or neurodivergent people, and there's a lot of anger about it in many circles. Because, and this is the key point, it's not just a neutral act of labeling, it's a constitutive act of language. It actually makes autism or disabilities conditions of deficient personhood. Now, the interesting thing is that when that point is made to non-disabled researchers, they often just can't fathom it. Because, of course, they are just persons. They're not persons with something. Now, it seems to me that there's an equivalent point in the imaginative use of disability or gender, one that also overlaps with the question of ethnic or racial stereotypes. This imaginative move saturates reality with a significance that is constitutive. It makes participation in the disabled or female state a really bad thing. The same is true of autism, which has been used by some genuinely well-intentioned theologians as an imaginative way of representing spiritual selfishness and isolation from God. So there are theologians who have spoken of a phenomenon that they call spiritual autism. Now, the response that this is just a metaphor and that the autistic person shouldn't be offended by their functioning as an emblem of sin is, I think, distinctly ableist. It doesn't inhabit the reality that is being made to function as representative of evil or deficiency, and so cannot even see the problem. Now, in using the word saturate, I'm gesturing to Charles Taylor's work on secularism, but also thinking of his more recent work on language that sees a link between linguistic philosophies themselves and the very conception of reality. Philosophies that see language simply as an arbitrary labeling suit modern reductionism with its thin account of reality as just the objective thing out there. Philosophies that recognize the capacity of language acts to constitute reality, however, suit thicker views of the world that recognize all reality to be saturated with significance, including linguistic significance. To imagine a world where the female is tortured or one where the female is blessed, to imagine a world where those very words invoke something good or something bad, is to constitute a reality for the female. To speak of autism as deficit, to describe the autistic person as not meeting the conditions of personhood, as some have, is to constitute a world in which this is the case for the autistic. Meghan notes that Ethiopians are demonized and demons are Ethiopianized. The same is true of the autistic. But this is not exclusively a practice of the popular religious culture that identifies autism with demon possession. Both the theological and the secular elite also do it all the time. Because this reductionistic linguistic world will always suit those who conform to the particular ideal of the normal. Okay, so what's lost and what's gained by applying gender and disability studies to the interpretation of ancient texts? Well, what's lost, I think, is mainly a presumptive neutrality. Meghan's work does all the careful contextualizing and historical work that other scholarship does, but it doesn't make these central or terminal in a way that displaces the central concerns, not central concerns, but her own concerns with gender and disability. What it does is to renew the conceptualizing of the elements with a further set of questions and insights that are generally excluded or neglected from the discussion hosted by those tyrannized by a certain normalcy, pushing beyond the intrinsic inabilities of that discourse. So I close with this comment. There's an autistic gain. This is an idea that we talked about in one of our recent seminars. Something distinctive that is gained by approaching things with an autistic purchase. There's a deaf gain. There's a disabled gain. By bringing these different issues to the table, Meghan's work brings a distinctive gain to this conversation.
Brad, thank you so much for your comments. Thank you all to the panelists. We are now at 12:15, so we definitely ran over time. So I'm assuming that we're okay with not taking a break, if everybody's okay with that. Yes, no, anybody needs to break. So what we'll do now is we'll roll on into Meghan's sorry, muted. Sorry. We'll roll on into Meghan's response, and then we will bring in the open discussion once she has completed her comments. Thank you all. Meghan?
That's perfect. Thank you all so much. And at some point I may have to like fill my mug with water or something like that. Since we're not taking a break, but I first want to just say thank you to each of you for your wonderful responses. I am so honored with the care and attention that you gave to the book, and all of the really kind things that you said mean a great deal to me. Okay, so first, Dr. Emanuel, thank you for your questions that both take the work seriously, but also come out of your really wonderful work on trauma. If you all haven't read yet, Dr. Emanuel's most recent book on trauma theory, trauma story, you gotta, it's great. Read it with students last semester. And it's been really generative for me to think through this question that you ask. and others that have emerged for me around thinking about trauma and disability together. Okay, so is ancient pain standard and normative? And what would we not define as trauma? And I think that this is a question that I'm asking myself all of the time now, because I'm also moving into thinking about mental disability and antiquity. Obviously, this project focused quite a great deal on physical disability. But what struck me at the end of the project is that, okay, we know that probably something like 80% of the population is disabled, and yet still the disabled body is stigmatized and marginalized. So I don't think it's fair to say that just because this is a more frequent encounter for people to have disabilities in antiquity, that somehow it's, to borrow the title from that great article, I don't think it's great to be a cripple in antiquity, right? I don't think it's the same as it is to be disabled in the contemporary world, but I think we have to be careful in our attempt to contextualize that we're assuming that just because more people have disabilities that they were always treated better. We know that, for example, like when we look at the Asclepion, this is presumably a shrine that is designed for people with disabilities to encounter it. And all of them, without exception, have like loads of stairs, for example. And we know that mobility impairments were like one of the main things that people needed to approach that shrine for. We also know that lots of women went there to request fertility from the god. And yet, if a woman is pregnant, she's not allowed to enter the shrine because the pregnant body always is representative of the potential of death. And you can't have the shrine being desecrated by death accidentally occurring in the space. So I think that even in a society where disability is more prevalent, somehow the disabled body is still not the normative body, quite clearly. And so, but I do think that what I've learned from thinking with you about trauma studies as well, and what your work has pointed out for me, is that this isn't a zero-sum game, and we have to think even about individuals experiencing this in different ways within that collective framing of different disabilities, both in antiquity and today. And that is something that disability studies scholars are constantly trying to do as well, of course, because the category disability itself encompasses people with a wide range of embodied experiences that at many times are at odds with each other, right? Like even as we're doing activist work in society, we are aware constantly of the fact that the thing that makes life and a space better for me may make life and a space worse for someone else with a different disability. So I really appreciate that question, and the following question that you had after that, which is where are the lines and how do we know when it is a disability? What's the difference between, you gave lots of wonderful examples, but righteous gender bending versus non-righteous gender bending was one of them that I typed fast enough. And so I think that we do have to be rigorous and nuanced in the way that we talk about something in antiquity that they don't have a single word for, right? There's no word for disability in antiquity. There's not even a single word for something like paralysis, right? Or even, I'm working on worry and anxiety right now. There's no single word for worry and anxiety. So I think that we have to rigorously identify when something is being stigmatized and pathologized and where those lines are and where the gray spaces are, but not in a way that turns us into historiography medical practitioners either, because I think that's something that has been done a great deal, for example, with the miracle accounts in the history of New Testament scholarship, is that we now, we found people who were kind of approaching them with, like the source critics, for example, were consistently approaching the miracle stories and trying to create like differential diagnosis of what is biologically happening in these spaces. And so I'm consistently coming back to this cultural model of disability, which takes into account both what is happening to the body biologically and physically in space and time, and then how that is perceived by the culture and the way in which those things are not ever really separate from each other or not touching each other, right? And then your final question about the modern relevance and have we assumed that modernity is the good place? I think yes, but it's harder to do every day. And that's one of the things that I think, for example, the recent Grammy performance by Sam Smith and Kim Petras and their own tour of hell puts on display quite vividly for us is that hell can be reimagined to critique the ways in which we have continually made hell on earth for ourselves by the way that we have brought these ideals about the body forward into history, perhaps without much reflection in some cases. And I think as I was writing the book, I knew I was going to write the epilogue, and there was this awful thing that kept happening where I kept finding new examples to include in the stupid epilogue. And I wanted it to stop because I long for a day when this work is not relevant anymore. That would be the ideal for me. But there were too many things to include. And it kept happening again and again to see, every new day bring me another example of a way in which our society's bodily standards could be weaponized against the people that inhabit that society. Thanks for raising that question. Thank you so much. All right, so Dr. Swai, first of all, I'm really excited for your book and your project, and I love the questions that you pose about the way that we can take and ask questions from the book of other sources. That's my dream come true. So thank you. That's what I want. Your question about where exactly is the boundary between deviance and acceptability and who gets to define it, I think that you're absolutely right to go to Solovog and others and say, look, it's not just about a one-time snapshot in history. It's about thinking about how there's a distance from an ideal. And I would say, and you added this later in your response as well, also an intersection with other overlapping forms of marginalization. So whereas one kind of body at a moment in history might represent a distance from an ideal, but other things like social class or masculinity kind of prop up that body and move them closer to the ideal. Other bodies that have the exact same composition or disability would find themselves much further from the ideal if they were enslaved or womanly or effeminate. So I think then the readings that you do of Luke 5, Luke 13, and Luke 19 are all really excellent places to pursue that kind of analysis. And I agree that the healing narratives suddenly read very differently if you take our own contemporary bodily values and norms into consideration, as well as the way in which the body is framed in antiquity so differently from today. I love that you're uncovering these moments of challenge in your own research. And I would say from my own perspective, I've also been thinking as well about the rupture between what would be considered miraculous in antiquity and what would be considered miraculous today. So in some work that I did for the Historical Jesus Project that's coming out in an edited volume soon, I talk about how the identification of cure as the miraculous in the gospel narratives makes tremendous sense in a situation where you have a large portion of the population that has illness and disability on a regular basis and very little recourse to medical attention. It's stunning to me that people who are so quick to rigorously contextualize other parts of scripture today could approach those miracles and offer a sort of flat reading of them as, aha, the miracle is that God is intervening in history and making a body conform to some norm. It seems to me that if Jesus was alive today, healing bodies would not be seen as miraculous, because you could just go down to the street, to the hospital, and have that done. And so the miraculous thing, I think, in our own day would resonate more with those ruptures where we see care instead of cure in the text. And so those places where you're identifying rupture or challenge to that narrative, I think would be the thing that would be miraculous in our own day, would be if the divine healer were actually sitting down and having a conversation with someone that lasted more than the 15 minutes that their health insurance plan would allow. So I think that turning the question to other texts raises really interesting questions, and I'm really excited to see the fruit of those efforts in your own work. Thank you. Dr. Vanden Eyckle. I don't mind at all that you focused only on the gain. Thank you. I'm okay with that. I think the fact that you're thinking about this for the classroom is, again, a dream come true for me. I would love for students to be reading this work. That is my hope, that it would be useful in some way. And I did try to write it accessibly, hopefully that they could conceivably do that. Why do we imagine the body, and what is the ideal body? And I love that you brought up Aquinas with the 33-year-old resurrected bodies, because it brings into relief for the students this idea that, like, oh my word, the ideal is very narrow, right? Right? Whenever we construct bodily norms, they're almost always excruciatingly narrow. And Rosemary Garland Thompson, the grandmother of disability studies, says this, right? That, like, we forget that the male athletic normative body is one that most people will never inhabit, right? And it's such a narrow norm that it sets us all up for failure. But then when you ask the question about the SBL and this crop of abstracts that you received, I think that your assessment of site and its role in scholarship would be one place that I would potentially think about in terms of the Western philosophical focus. So in the ancient sources, of course, like we as biblical scholars are focused on this Western philosophical canon. And so we can't help but be influenced to some extent by the things that Plato and Aristotle say about sight and its relationship to perception and the intellect. Even if it is unconscious ableism that we are bringing to the task. But I also think that physical disability in general is the thing that people most think of when they think about disability. And I think that it's also not just the philosophers who do this. I think it's because the New Testament texts themselves pay a great deal of attention to this, because they are themselves influenced by this Greek and Roman worldview that they find in the text that they're hearing about and reading and influenced by in their own education, right? And so we see this in the contemporary world with, like, for example, the movie Bird Box, which is an apocalyptic imagination of what happens if you suddenly cannot see in a post-apocalyptic world. And we see this in even when I first started my job here, I found out that there were folks in the sociology department who were having their sociology students pretend to be blind so that they could learn about blindness in their classroom and have, like, and I mean, very quickly had a conversation with them and kind of explained why this, like, this kind of cripping up for our students would be ableist and problematic, and why you wouldn't want to be doing that in a classroom setting. But I think that there is a way in which the educators who were going in that direction were thinking that this would be an easy way that our students could think about disability in their own bodies imaginatively. They had not yet taken the next step, which is to say that, of course, that is all based on a deficit model that assumes that this is like the able-bodied people assume that the incurrence of a disability that is not congenital is like a tragedy, that and one of the worst ones that could happen to their body, and that this is part of what informs the social stigma around disabilities. So all of that to say that I think that there's a sort of both philosophically logical emphasis on blindness in our field because it's in our texts and people just go to it. But I also think that it's deeply ingrained in the ableism of our contemporary world. And I don't mean that as a slight to any of the people that suggested those abstracts. We need to think about blindness in our texts as well. But I think that when we do think about disability and antiquity, it is good to also own up to why we're focusing on particular kinds of disabilities. And this happens all the time though. Like right now, there's a huge focus all of a sudden on mental disabilities because we're living in a para-pandemic world where people have newly acquired mental disabilities. So like, I think that all focus on disability is good and I applaud that and there needs to be more of it, but I also do think that you're right to ask the question, which is why do we train our attention on particular kinds of disability in our work, and what can we do differently around that? Thank you for asking that. Mira, I am thrilled. Honestly, I was nervous since you're working on this right now. When I was like, okay, when you said you kept having these moments, I was like, oh no, what did I? I was waiting for the other shoe to drop the whole time you were speaking. So I'm really grateful that you appreciated the opportunity to see things differently and are willing to engage in that conversation, but also in such fruitful ways. I think this idea that the trees are praying on behalf of the men and doing intercessory prayer is awesome. I agree. And I had not thought about it that way, but yes. I do think that you can still say that the men are stand-ins for the readers, even though weeping does represent a kind of compromised male body engaged in an effeminate response. I think that weeping is something that, though it is coded as effeminate in antiquity and for sure in the Hell literature, I think I cited in the book Blake Lyerly's work on this, that she talks about how for John Chrysostom, weeping was useful and thought to be an important part of the therapeutic process around treating depression. So I think that this is one of those places where we can talk about, as Dr. Macaskill suggests, crip gain, right? There's disability gain in antiquity that they're not calling that, but that's what it is. There's a way in which weeping, even though it is coded negatively by the broader society, is for a moment in time coded positively and part of the therapeutic process. And this is why the medical authors, I think, are constantly having to define and redefine where the bounds are around certain kind of affective and mental states, because it's fuzzy when something is pejorative and pathological and when it is productive and useful. And that in part has to do with the way that they think about bodies in both in the humoral system and in other medical ways of thinking, as this kind of attempt to achieve balance. And that means that sometimes the things that you would normally not want in excess, you do want in some measure. So, but I think that your rethinking of that could still suggest that we should feel sorry for these men. But it's also possible that we could be invited into embodying the weeping posture ourselves, and thereby repenting of our own failures and cleansing the body in that regard. How are bodies geographic markers in the travel experience? What a cool question. I'm so excited for your work on this. I wonder if asking this will to some extent intervene in the comparisons that always get made between First Enoch and other apocalypses. The argument is always made based on Copeland's Bouch's wonderful work that shows that, First Enoch has this very traceable geography. And then you get to these other apocalypses and it sort of seems like they've lost their Cartesian grid or something, because you can't exactly map them in the same way that you can map First Enoch. But if the bodies are themselves part of the geography of the space, maybe what we need to do is instead rethink the way that we're thinking about geography, rather than talking about the way that the Apocalypse of Paul does or doesn't fit the way that we would map something. All right. Dr. McAskill. So thank you so much for bringing the disability perspective and your own experience to bear on the conversation, as well as your own research on Second Enoch. You're reading a Second Enoch that intervenes in this conversation about whether this is a fringe sect or whether there's, redaction happening that explains this away. I think is really needed. And I'm definitely on board with your thesis about religious combination and recombination. I think that is absolutely reflective of the kind of cultural exchange that we see happening in history, and especially in that text. And I think we need so much more to be written on Second Enoch, because I think that recombination can show us things about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and as well as other lines of thinking that will be illuminating, even though it's difficult work to do. So thank you for immersing yourself in one of those kind of impossible texts. The larger point you made there about how apocryphal works are often marginalized and seen as weird or not relevant, I'm really grateful for, because that is what I was hoping to do with the project. Apocryphal works are often marginalized, as you say, and I wanted to not, and a lot of the work that's done on these texts frequently is to try to explain them away and say, okay, so there's this weird hell stuff happening in early Christianity, and isn't that gross? And we should stand in judgment of it. So here's the way you get rid of it. You say it's really based on the Romans and they invented it and it's not our problem. And if you're happen to be coming from a Christian tradition, it's not Christian's problem. Or you say it is these apocryphal texts and they're not in the canon. So like that, does it really matter anyway? Probably not, except for that they were read on Good Friday until quite late. So we know that Christians are reading these texts and using them. We know that also because Dante reads the Apocalypse of Paul before he writes the Inferno and says that. So like we know that this is something that is seen as authoritative in some way, even if it's not in the list, right? And there's no physical Bibles that people are carrying around. So that also delimits the way in which we can see canon functioning. If we use Beauvon's definition of, his category of texts that are useful for the soul, many of these texts were still seen to be useful for the soul for a very long time. So I think that I didn't want to talk about these texts to kind of just elevate them as a kind of, oh, this is gore porn and we can just push it to the side, but to take seriously that this has had a real impact on the tradition, and then offer a legitimate way of reading them from multiple scholarly lenses. And my hope is that most readers can find some way in to see that and think about it from their own perspective and what they're doing in the scholarly project. I had introduced this idea of the imaginary versus the real as a way of thinking about apocalypses, but you're absolutely right to say that this is also equally relevant for the way that we think about disability and disability studies, both as ancient historians and as contemporary scholars of disability studies. Thank you for the wonderful explanation on person first versus identity first language. I hope that this is being recorded so that I can share it with my students. I think that it's very hard for people to understand just exactly how something that seems neutral or even kind can be ableist, but it really is. And the way that you talk about this as not a neutral act of labeling, but constitutive is beautiful and perfect for getting at that. I loved the recourse to Chuck Taylor's work on secularism because, of course, what we're doing when we imagine things is that we saturate reality with status. And I had not heard of the theologians who talk about spiritual autism, but thank you for naming that. That's horrifying. And I will pay better attention to that conversation now. The link between how we think about the world and the world that we create is something that Dr. Van den Eyck also brought up when he was thinking about his students. I think that we have to take very seriously the power that we have when we imagine. And that's the thing that I kind of, I guess, hope for future engagements with Afterlife and this project. If there is something that people can take forward, is to think about the power that we have when we do religious imagination or even secular imagination. I think that we need thicker spirituality, particularly in the historical moment that we're living in, and particularly for people with disabilities. In the para-pandemic world that we're living in, people with disabilities are being expected to perform bodily normativity, even as their experience of living with a disability has gotten much, much worse than it was 5 years ago. And there's the eagerness to return to normal so that we can all pretend like this pandemic thing didn't happen is now a burden that is being unequally shared by marginalized bodies in our society. And it has also manufactured disability, right? Of course, because more people have disabilities than ever before. People have acquired new disabilities, or people with certain kinds of mental disabilities are experiencing that they are now worse. And we see this in all of the populations that we inhabit. I see that you're all nodding because I know like this is the reality that we're teaching in the midst of, right? So as we're doing that, I am seeing that my students, my friends, my family members, we all need thick spirituality that takes seriously the power that imagination has, and not what I would call insta-influencer spirituality, which is the thing you can find most readily right now, which is sort of soundbite, glossy, quick fix. You're capable to solve all of your problems on your own with your nice dream box in front of you. And all you have to do is watch the right TikTok and you'll have the magic answers that put it all together for you. There's a lot of that thin spirituality on offer. And I think as biblical scholars, as historians, as theologians, we have an opportunity to offer something better, both for the disability community, but as we know from the disability community, frequently one of the disability gains is that the thing that makes the world better for the disability community usually makes the world better for all of us when we think about inclusive design. So thank you for naming that I have lost the presumption of neutrality. I really did try to be careful and to be rigorous in my historical work and to read widely and deeply. But I also did that because I want people to see that disability history is history, that gender history is history, and that just because I'm doing something that might be labeled niche in certain circles of the academy does not mean that you can ignore these bodies and these people who were part of early Christianity and part of the world that early Christianity developed and flourished in. Thanks.
Megan, thank you very much for your comments and responses. What I'd like to do is just give the panelists a couple of moments if you wish to respond to Megan's comments. Please try to keep them very brief. We do have 1 or 2 questions in the chat room, so we want to try to get to those as well. But I just want to give, so if you have a response, I don't want to assume everyone does, but just raise your hand and Megan can call on you. How's that? Tara.
Dr.
Oops,
Amanda.
go ahead. Sorry, I wanted to jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much for what thoughtful feedback to produce so quickly. I'm very impressed. Just want to say again, very quick, I really appreciate, I wrote something down that you just said, Megan, which I think is so beautiful. We have to take seriously the power that we have when we imagine. And I just want to point that line out that you said, just brilliant. I will absolutely be citing you on that one. But in these conversations, I also realized something else that I think is a profound gain, which is you also remind us, in doing this work on disability studies and gender studies, you remind us that early Christian thinkers were indeed thinking quite bodily and quite bodily in the eschaton. And I think that this can actually intersect quite well with conversations on Christian anti-Semitism. There's sort of this assumption that Jews are of the body and Christians are of the spirit, and we create this binary and this, this hierarchy of it. And everyone's just thinking bodily, and let's not make a hierarchy about it. So I think your work can actually deconstruct false assumptions of different, not just false assumptions of difference between Judaism and Christianity, but false, hierarchies that are made from that assumption. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, in the current project, I'm working on prayer in the body, and I'm consistently trying to figure out, when was it that we decided that Christians weren't interested in the body? Because it seems quite clearly that they are for a while. And I do think you're right that some of that is deeply grounded in anti-Judaism. And I hope that we can keep surfacing that as well in the conversation. Okay.
Others wish to respond? You're all too reserved. Grant.
Yeah, maybe just on the back of that, to raise the point that I think that there is an interesting space that might be opened up in this conversation for thinking about where or how some of this material develops alongside and in dialogue with, if that's the right expression to use, some of the material that we would genuinely categorize as Gnostic. I mean, that's potentially a difficult category to use. But again, one of the interesting things for me looking at Second Enoch, 2 Enoch, I think it's a little later than many others do. I think it probably emerged in Syria, maybe in Mesopotamia. And I think there's lots of evidence that there's some kind of conversation going on with traditions that represent the creation of matter as something done by agents other than God. So I think there's something potentially really interesting as we're raising this question about taking bodily realities seriously, about how these other traditions might be recast. And it's often the case that Zoroastrianism, for example, is portrayed as dualistic and is not interested in the body, and that's nonsense. So I think there's a really interesting space for thinking about how Gnostic material, which I hate using that term because it just squashes all things into this one category, but how these Sethian traditions, for example, Valentinian traditions, might all be part of this developing picture of bodies and so on. A lot of that was sort of woven through the conversation, which I think is the interesting point. And just to repeat something that I hope came through in my own comments, I don't see Meghan's work as not doing due diligence on the historical side of things. If anything, it does more diligence than many others do, because it asks a further set of questions about the historical stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, the book was too long when I submitted it, so I did have to cut a lot of things, including some notes. But I'm interested in your later dating of Second Enoch. I'll be excited to engage with that more. And then I think that absolutely, if we take seriously the way that early Christians in these texts seem to be engaging body and soul, and the way that they're theorizing and framing this, I absolutely think, and then also that the generic distinctions, as you pointed out, are sort of arbitrary around these texts, that we do have to bring a range of the so-called apocryphal literature into our conversations in different ways. And that's a question that I think I'm going to keep asking for quite some time, is to figure out, like, what are the boundaries and the genre distinctions that no longer serve, and what happens when we put these things together in different ways? Because you're right, that Zoroastrian dualism is not non-bodily, and to say that the so-called Gnostic texts are themselves also not interested in the body is a useful heuristic for your undergraduate seminar, but maybe really problematic if it limits the kinds of questions that you ask about who those Christians were and what they were thinking and why they wrote these texts. So that has given me, for sure, more to think about, maybe others as well, I imagine. I think we have at least one attendee that has a hand raised. If there's no, if the
Yeah, anything else from the panelists first? Okay, Jillian, if you would like, I think it was Vincent that had the question. If you want to bring him in.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome, Vincent.
I've been joined as a panelist. Wow, upgrade. I want to first express gratitude for this wonderfully probing and thoughtful volume. It's just amazing. I've learned so much. And I particularly want to ask about the section on Black garments and Black faces, Black skin on pages 113 and following. And so I'd like to hear what you think about the choice of the use of the adjective racialized on page 115 in the quote, "In hell's heterotopia, both men and women are depicted as racialized other as a mechanism for containing their sexuality." And so I'm wondering, do you think that that adjective imports later ideas about race into the Greco-Roman world? And I asked this question in light of the later discussion in the book, which is equally interesting, about orange is the new black, where you refer to post-racial. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I am aware, and I was aware that by using that word that I could be seen to be bringing contemporary notions of race back into the past, and that is not my intention. And I did, in the notes in those sections, really try to rely on the historians who are doing the work around race and ethnicity in antiquity and in late antiquity. And Candace Buckner's article in JAR had not come out yet when I was finishing the copy edits for the book, so I should have also included that there. That's a lacuna. I should have had her in the notes there as well. But I believe that it is important to note the difference between the way that we think about race in the contemporary world and in the ancient world. And yet at the same time, just like with disability, we could easily say, well, there's no word for disability in antiquity, so it doesn't make any sense at all to talk about disability in antiquity. And it would have not made any sense to contemporary readers of a book that was meant for a broad audience if I didn't use the word disability. So I had like a bit of a semantic problem here, right? Where as a scholar of disability studies, I understand that disability doesn't exist in antiquity, but I can't talk about this thing that I know that people in the audience know I'm talking about and name it. And so that's where the cultural model of disability is really helpful for me. With respect to race, I think it's important to do the same thing. Yes, what's going on in the contemporary world, colonially and post-colonially, has influenced and inflected the way that I, as a North American white woman, think about race and a scholar of history, yes. But that's not to say that the Ethiopian body is not stigmatized in a way in antiquity that is important to reckon with and identify. So just like I don't think it was great to be a cripple in all times and all places in antiquity, I also don't think that it was always excellent and better and advantageous to inhabit a dark-skinned body in antiquity. And I do think that people were making ethnic distinctions, not just with Black skin and white skin, or skin color, but with other ethnic identities and distinctions in the Roman Empire. And as I was constructing that sentence, I thought that racialized would be a way to convey for a broad audience what was happening. And I'd hoped that the footnotes would do the work of doing the historical contextualization as well as the text around it. But you're right, that we have to be careful about importing European ideas about race into ancient texts where those ideas aren't already there, right? We don't need to make it worse. But I do think that it can equally make it worse if we pretend as though ethnic distinction or identity had no role in the way that ancient people thought about things, and that they were living in some kind of pre-colonial utopia with respect to ethnic identity and race. I think that too easily absolves us of our history. Thanks for that question, and thank you for reading so carefully.
All right, I'm going to ask a question. Take some rank privilege here. Mayor raised this in her response about with the apocalypse of, forgive my voice is going away again. You mentioned the idea about, we've talked a lot about physical disability and mental disabilities in this discussion. It was absolutely phenomenal. I'm wondering if Mayor raised the question about the proud heart in these men who were not allowed to come into the city. I'm wondering if are those types of issues things that we can consider disabilities and antiquity, or even today, I suppose, but do you think they're kind of, you know, issues of pride or whatever else of soulful issues are kind of understood as disabilities in antiquity as well?
I think that it depends on the circumstance and which philosopher you're asking, but they absolutely, and or which Christian theologian or Jewish thinker, right? Like, because the way in which people imagine bodies with respect to soul or vice and virtue is frequently medicalized in antiquity. Ancient authors of all varieties and late ancient authors are making recourse to medical thinking increasingly, in part under Roman influence. And so there are certainly some authors who would pathologize something like pride. But then the question is there a stigma associated to that? Is that seen as non-normative, or is that something that is seen as kind of common and expected? And is there a kind of like performance of owning certain kinds of pathologies publicly as speakers and rhetors? And I think we see some of that happening as well. I'm curious about what others think. I'm not sure I have a great answer to that question.
Anyone want to jump in on?
I mean, I can't speak for all of kind of, you know, ancient literature, but I wonder whether in certain early Christian texts, there isn't a distinction between, say, mental disability and physical disability because of the way kind of thought processes become a corporeal function. So one of the things I notice is that, you know, when we read English translations, we're looking at mind, and that's a very modern concept. We have this discrete entity that we think about, but actually what you see in some of the earlier texts is it's reasoning processes that are being judged, at which point something like pride doesn't follow the expected reasoning process, which puts it at the opposite side of an expected boundary. And if we think about kind of the cultural model of disability, where disability is constructed by othering at the other side of that boundary, something like pride could effectively function as disability. I know we don't use the term, but there is an othering that takes place depending on where that boundary has been put. Now, I don't know how that functions in the tours of hell, but I'm wondering whether that kind of aspect of othering might be a way to think about this idea as we construct kind of boundaries of deviance, if you like.
Can I say something here? Do we have time? I'm sorry, Megan, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm reading is really a lot of times these texts are read out loud in groups, right? So one of the things that struck me when reading Megan's book is that she talks about how there's this equation, right? With like disabled bodies are sinful bodies, and how you take that back with you from the world of the text into your world around you. I'm not saying you say that they are sinful bodies. I'm saying that that's how the text present them, right? That sinful bodies are disabled bodies. Just want to make that clear. You take that back to the world around you, and you're hearing this in community, and maybe you're looking around, right, at the other people in your community and thinking your body, which is defective, right, means you are full of sin. But it could go the other way, and forgive me a pop culture reference here, but you know how like in Star Trek, there's that episode where like people are having these pains and they think they're phantom pains, but then when they put some sort of filter on, they can see like worms eating them or like munching on them. And then I'm almost wondering if like, if you're looking around and you're taught by these texts that certain things are sins, if it also makes you look at their real bodies, which may not be disabled in the real world, as actually living embodied in a disabled world that you're now seeing, right? Like you, prideful ecclesiastical member, are actually getting penetrated or whatever, and you're not seeing it yet. That it's opening up a way to maybe view people who are being castigated by these texts, especially the Apocalypse of Paul, with all of their ecclesiastical sins that they're illuminating, expositing, that maybe they seem fine now, but in reality, their body is super defective, right? So even if pride is not necessarily a disabling category, it could make, if people are recognizing those sins in others, it could make them see their bodies differently, almost as if like a wool is being pulled out of their eyes, or they're wearing their like decoder glasses or something like that.
Yeah, I think that the body could switch very quickly from subject to object. And you were constantly aware in these texts that that could happen. You're right. Grant.
It's just a little point. I'm not sure how relevant it is to all of this, but I think there's also the point that I think we can sometimes think about bodies in quite static kinds of ways, where so much of this, I mean, what I'm thinking about is the fact that so much of the literature around virtue is really interested in the passions and in the way that the passions are to be regulated, and the identification of those passions with effectively with not just the anatomy, but then with the physiology, and with the physiology operating properly. And I think that's maybe just an interesting thread in all of this as well, is thinking about whether sometimes we can default to fairly static or even anatomical accounts of bodies as distinct maybe from physiological and functioning accounts of bodies with passions and how those passions are to be regulated.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way of framing it.
Very good. Anyone else? Megan, for closing comments?
Just thank you all for thinking about hell with me, and about especially thinking about how we can center disability and gender in this conversation, and how we can still do historiography and really demonstrating the way that disability history is history. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, I guess that brings us to the close of our very interesting and very helpful discussion. I just want to thank Megan and all the panelists for your participation. It's been a really good conversation, and I can't wait to get this up on recorded and up on social media for people to hear and for y'all to use in classrooms if possible. But thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. You're just been a wonderful panel with some very insightful thoughts to a very great book. And thank you, Megan, for writing it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Take care.